My boyfriend thought I forgave his affair. He never expected what was waiting at the altar. The sentence that destroyed my future wasn't shouted in the middle of an argument or buried in a late-night text. My boyfriend looked me straight in the eyes, smiled as casually as if we were discussing dinner, and said, "We're not married yet. Sleeping with someone else isn't wrong." I didn't cry. I didn't yell or demand an explanation. I just stared at the man I was supposed to marry in 6 weeks and realized I'd been sharing my life with someone I no longer recognized. He thought I'd forgive him. What he didn't know was that, in that moment, I stopped thinking like his future wife. I started planning the day everyone else would finally see the man I'd been living with, and all it would take was one USB drive. My name is Natalie Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I own a cybersecurity consulting company in Seattle. We aren't the biggest firm in the industry, but over the past 8 years, we've earned the trust of banks, healthcare providers, and technology companies by protecting information they couldn't afford to lose. At work, I questioned everything. At home, I questioned nothing. For almost 4 years, I loved Ethan Brooks without hesitation. He had an easy sense of humor, stayed calm when everyone else panicked, and somehow always showed up with coffee after my longest client meetings. After 12-hour days staring at security logs, he'd pull me onto the couch and massage my shoulders until I finally relaxed. He made everyday life feel safe. At least that's what I believed. Our wedding was only a few weeks away. The invitations had been mailed, the venue was fully paid for, and my mother had cried during my final dress fitting. Everywhere we went, people told us how lucky we were. Back then, I believed them. Looking back, the warning signs had been there for months. Ethan suddenly became protective of his phone. Whenever it buzzed, he'd angle the screen away before reading the message. Late-night calls became routine, and every time I asked who it was, he'd answer without missing a beat. Marcus. It was the perfect answer, because I had no reason to question it. Marcus Reed had been Ethan's best friend since college. He'd helped him pick out my engagement ring, stood beside him the night he proposed, and celebrated every milestone with us. Ethan used to joke that Marcus knew more about our wedding than we did, and I always laughed. Marcus also worked in cybersecurity. His company occasionally partnered with mine, so seeing the two of them constantly talking about work never raised any alarms. I trusted both of them completely. That trust made it easy to explain away every change. Ethan started coming home later than usual, but there was always a reason. Traffic. Marcus needed my help. We grabbed dinner after work. Each excuse sounded reasonable on its own. I never noticed how they were slowly becoming a pattern. Everything changed on a Thursday evening when a client canceled at the last minute. I picked up Ethan's favorite Thai takeout and decided to surprise him by coming home early. When I walked into our condo, the shower was running upstairs. His laptop was sitting open on the dining table. Normally, I would have walked right past it. We'd always respected each other's privacy. Then a notification appeared before the screen dimmed. An email draft addressed to Marcus. The subject line read, "Updated security architecture." Attached to it was one of my company's confidential design files. I froze. For a few seconds, I searched for any explanation that would make what I was seeing seem harmless. Maybe he'd opened the wrong file. Maybe Marcus already had permission to review it. The more excuses I invented, the less convincing they sounded. Instead of confronting Ethan, I quietly took a photo of the screen with my phone, then closed the laptop exactly as I'd found it. A minute later, he came downstairs, still drying his hair with a towel. "You're home early." "I thought I'd surprise you." "You definitely did." He smiled, wrapped his arms around me, and kissed my forehead. I hugged him back out of instinct, but something felt different. For the first time since we'd met, his embrace didn't feel like home. The next morning, I called Liam, the senior security engineer who'd been with me since the company was founded. He was one of the few people I trusted completely, not just because he was exceptionally good at his job, but because he knew how to keep his mouth shut. I showed him the photo I'd taken from Ethan's laptop. He studied it for only a few seconds before looking back at me. "I'll pull the access logs," he said. "Don't mention this to anyone." "I won't." He called me later that evening. "Natalie." Something in his voice made my stomach tighten before he said another word. "I found unauthorized downloads." "Are you certain?" "I checked the logs 3 times. He paused. "The activity came from your home network." I sat there without answering. It wasn't that I doubted Liam. I didn't. The problem was that I already knew what his findings pointed to, and I wasn't ready to accuse Ethan based on a single report. If I was going to destroy my own relationship, I needed evidence that couldn't be explained away. The following morning, I hired Daniel Foster, a private investigator who specialized in cybercrime and digital forensics. Before opening his own firm, he'd spent nearly 20 years investigating corporate espionage. After listening to everything I'd discovered, he folded his hands across the desk and said, "If you're wrong, you'll finally have some peace of mind." "And if I'm right?" His expression didn't change. "Then you'll have proof no one can dispute." I hired him before I walked out of his office. The next 3 weeks became the hardest performance of my life. Every morning, Ethan kissed me goodbye. Every evening, we talked about flowers, honeymoon plans, and our first dance as if nothing had changed. While he believed we were planning a wedding, Daniel quietly rebuilt Ethan's digital trail, following everything from deleted emails to travel records and financial activity until the whole picture came into focus. Then Ethan announced he was going away for what he called a guy's weekend. Marcus rented a cabin outside Portland, he said while throwing clothes into a duffel bag. Just the two of you? And a couple of his co-workers. I nodded. You should go. You've been working too hard. He kissed me before heading for the door. I'll miss you. I'll miss you too. The words came easily, but they no longer meant what they once had. The next afternoon, Daniel called. I think you should sit down. I already am. There was a brief silence before he spoke again. Ethan never went to Portland. My grip tightened around the phone. Where is he? At a hotel about 30 miles outside the city. By himself? No. Another pause. He checked in with Olivia Hayes. The name landed like a punch. Olivia was Ethan's ex-girlfriend. The woman he'd promised was long out of his life. A moment later, Daniel emailed me the photographs. The first showed them laughing over dinner by candlelight. The second captured Ethan reaching across the table to hold her hand. The last one ended every excuse I'd been trying to make for him. They walked into the hotel together, used a single key card, and never came back out until the following morning. I stared at those pictures for nearly an hour. I didn't cry. I didn't lose my temper. I just kept looking at them, hoping my eyes had somehow misunderstood what was right in front of me. 2 days later, Ethan came home acting exactly like the man I'd fallen in love with. He wrapped his arms around me before I could even close the front door. I missed you. So did I. He smelled like the cologne I'd given him for Christmas. The thought that Olivia had probably smelled it too made my stomach turn. That evening, he entertained me with stories about hiking trails, campfires, and terrible cabin food. I listened, asked a few questions, and nodded at all the right moments while every lie slipped effortlessly out of his mouth. 3 days later, once Daniel had verified the hotel records and matched them with Ethan's travel history, I decided it was time to ask him one simple question. After dinner, we sat together on the couch with the television playing quietly in the background. Ethan? Are you happy with us? He frowned. Of course I am. You've never wondered if you chose the wrong life? He reached for my hand. Where's this coming from? I was just thinking. He watched me for several long seconds before letting out a slow breath. I guess there's something I should tell you. My heart didn't race. I'd already heard the answer. I just needed to hear him say it. A while back, he looked down at the floor. I slept with someone. I didn't interrupt. It only happened once. When I still said nothing, he gave me an awkward smile. But it wasn't really cheating. I met his eyes. Why not? He answered without hesitation. We weren't married yet. Sleeping with someone else isn't wrong. I held his gaze for another moment, then reached over and gently squeezed his hand. I understand. The relief on his face was immediate. He honestly believed I'd forgiven him. What he never realized was that, in that moment, our relationship quietly came to an end. From then on, I wasn't planning a wedding anymore. I was planning the day the truth would catch up with him. The morning after Ethan confessed, he walked into the kitchen, looking lighter than he had in weeks, as if finally telling me had taken a weight off his shoulders. While I poured coffee, he slipped his arms around my waist. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For understanding. I gave a small nod. We all make mistakes. The relief on his face was immediate. He kissed my cheek, grabbed his keys, and paused at the door. I love you. I love you too. The reply came out on instinct. As soon as the door clicked shut, I let out the breath I'd been holding. I wasn't forgiving him. I was buying myself time. From that day on, Ethan and I were living in two completely different realities. He believed we were counting down to our wedding. I was counting down to the day everything he had hidden would be exposed. That afternoon, I met Daniel Foster. He slid a thick investigation file across the table before quietly saying, I wish this report looked different. I already knew it wouldn't. The report followed them from dinner, all the way to the hallway outside their hotel room, with every stop documented by a timestamp. Daniel turned another page. It gets worse. He handed me copies of several encrypted emails. They weren't love letters. They were business transactions. My company's confidential files had been sent from Ethan's laptop to a Shell consulting account, then automatically forwarded to Marcus's software company. Who set up the consulting account? I asked. Ethan. And Marcus knew? He received every file. The financial records told the rest of the story. Over 6 months, Marcus's company had transferred money into Ethan's fake consulting business. Every payment matched another batch of stolen documents. Daniel tapped one highlighted transaction. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was an arrangement. I sat there staring at the paperwork, and suddenly dozens of little moments made sense. Ethan had pushed for a more expensive honeymoon, encouraged me to upgrade the flowers, and laughed whenever I worried about the wedding budget. It hadn't been generosity. He'd been spending money he'd earned by selling my company's work. Daniel closed the folder. I'm sorry. I shook my head. No, I'm sorry I kept looking for reasons to trust him. He didn't try to argue. There wasn't much left to say. Back at the office, Liam was already waiting in the conference room. The audit's finished, he said. He connected his laptop to the monitor, bringing up a timeline that tracked every unauthorized login, download, and file transfer. Daniel's investigation and our internal records matched almost perfectly. There are 23 confidential documents, Liam said. How much damage can they do? He hesitated before answering. If Marcus builds his next platform with this information, years of our research disappear overnight. That was all I needed to hear. Keep this between us, I said. No one outside this room hears about it. He nodded. What about Ethan? I'll deal with Ethan. Liam studied me for a moment. You okay? I forced a faint smile. I will be. At home, life settled into an almost unsettling routine. Every evening, Ethan wanted my opinion on flowers, table settings, or music for the reception, completely unaware that I was no longer planning a future with him. I was simply making sure he never suspected what was coming. What do you think about white roses instead of ivory? Whichever you like, he smiled. I knew you'd leave it up to me. A few nights later, we went to our final cake tasting. Ethan laughed as he fed me a forkful of vanilla cake while the photographer captured what looked like another happy memory. Looking back at those pictures later, one thing stood out. Only one of us knew the relationship was already over. The appointments kept coming after that. Flowers, music, final details with the officiant. Ethan talked excitedly about everything that would happen after the wedding. Our first anniversary. The house we'll buy. Our kids someday. I listened, occasionally catching myself searching his face for the man I'd fallen in love with. Every time I came up empty. One evening, we sat down to finish the seating chart. Marcus should probably be closer to us, Ethan said, leaning over my shoulder. He is my best man. I looked at Marcus's name for a second before nodding. That makes sense. Ethan smiled, completely unaware of the irony. If he noticed anything different about me during those weeks, he never mentioned it. Maybe guilt made him believe what he wanted to believe, or maybe he simply never imagined I'd find out. A week later, Daniel called me back to his office. It's finished, he said, handing me an encrypted flash drive. Every email, every payment, every transfer, every photo has been verified. None of this depends on assumptions anymore. I turned the drive over in my hand. So this is everything. He nodded. If they deny it, they'll be arguing with evidence, not you. That was exactly what I wanted. Over the next few nights, I organized everything into 2 folders. The first was called Wedding Slideshow. It contained engagement photos, vacation pictures, birthdays, and family gatherings, the kind of presentation every guest would expect. The second folder looked almost identical. Its name was Backup Files. Inside was every piece of evidence we'd collected, from the hotel surveillance to the financial records linking Ethan and Marcus to the stolen files. I tested the presentation over and over until every slide played exactly when it should. It didn't need dramatic music or clever editing. The evidence could tell the story on its own. 3 days before the wedding, I met with my attorney, Rebecca Collins. She reviewed the entire file one last time before closing the folder. This is solid, she said. If this ends up in court, it will hold. She placed several sealed envelopes on the table. Civil complaint, corporate theft, trade secret misappropriation. There were other filings as well, each one ready to be submitted if necessary. You don't have to file these today, Rebecca said. You could cancel the wedding, walk away, and never see either of them again. I considered it for a moment. It would certainly be easier. Ethan and Marcus could disappear, find new jobs, invent new stories, and move on as though nothing had happened. I couldn't let that happen. I slowly shook my head. They made their choices. Rebecca simply nodded. The night before the rehearsal dinner, Ethan found me sitting alone on the balcony. You've been quiet lately. Just wedding nerves. He laughed. I was starting to think you were getting cold feet. For a split second, I almost told him everything. Instead, I looked at him and said, I'm exactly where I need to be. He reached for my hand. I can't wait to call you my wife. I wondered if he believed those words himself, or if they'd become just another lie he told without thinking. I never asked. The answer wouldn't have changed what was coming. Later that night, after Ethan fell asleep, I walked into my home office. The apartment was silent. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop and went through every file one last time to make sure nothing had been missed. When I was finished, I slipped the drive into the inside pocket of my handbag. It looked like any other USB drive. No one would have given it a second glance. I switched off the light, glanced toward the bedroom, and quietly closed the office door behind me. The plan was finished. Now all I had to do was wait. Our wedding day arrived beneath a cloudless sky. The forecast had promised rain all week, yet that morning, sunlight spilled through the bedroom windows as if nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. Maybe it was a perfect day, just not for a wedding. I woke before my alarm and lay quietly for a while, listening to Ethan breathe beside me. He looked completely at peace, unaware that this would be the last morning we'd ever wake up in the same bed. His wedding band rested on the nightstand beside him. My engagement ring was still on my finger. By the end of the day, neither would matter. He opened his eyes and smiled. Morning, beautiful. Morning. You nervous? A little. He chuckled. Good. I thought I was the only one. He leaned over to kiss my forehead. I can't believe today's finally here. I held his gaze for a moment. There wasn't the slightest trace of guilt on his face. If he was carrying one, he'd buried it so well that even now he looked like a man about to marry the love of his life. We left the apartment separately, following the old tradition of not seeing each other again until the ceremony. Ethan headed to the hotel to get ready with his groomsmen, while I drove to the bridal suite where my mother, bridesmaids, photographers, makeup artists, and florists had already transformed the room into controlled chaos. Champagne glasses clinked. Someone laughed across the room. Hairdryers buzzed in the background, while bouquets of fresh white roses filled the air with their fragrance. The atmosphere was exactly what every bride dreams about. My mother wrapped me in a hug.
You look happy.
I met her eyes. I am. That wasn't entirely untrue. For weeks, I'd been trapped between suspicion and certainty. By that morning, the waiting was over. Whatever happened next, I'd never have to wonder who Ethan really was again. Claire, my maid of honor, adjusted my veil before stepping back to admire her work. You've been smiling all morning. I've had a lot on my mind. Nervous about the vows? I shook my head. No. Then what? I caught my own reflection in the mirror. I'm ready. Claire laughed. I'll take that as a good sign. If only she knew what I meant. The ceremony overlooked Lake Washington. White roses lined the aisle, and crystal chandeliers scattered warm afternoon light across the ballroom. Nearly 200 guests had filled the seats. Family, friends, business partners, old classmates, and clients who believed they were about to witness the happiest day of our lives. Outside the bridal suite, the string quartet began playing. A coordinator knocked softly on the door. It's time. My father stepped forward and offered me his arm. You okay? I slipped my hand through his. I've never been more certain. He smiled proudly. That's my girl. As the ballroom doors opened, every conversation stopped. Guests rose to their feet, phones lifted into the air, and dozens of smiling faces turned toward us. Across the room, Ethan waited beneath the floral arch. The moment he saw me, his face lit up. Anyone watching would have believed they were looking at a man hopelessly in love. If I hadn't known the truth, I probably would have believed it too. When I reached the altar, he leaned closer and whispered, "You look incredible." So do you. I meant it. It was also the last genuine compliment I would ever give him. The officiant welcomed everyone before speaking about love, trust, and commitment. The words echoed through the ballroom, drawing quiet smiles from our guests. I listened without reacting. No one else could hear the irony. Not yet. As the officiant spoke about trust, loyalty, and honesty, I almost found myself laughing. Those were the same promises Ethan had made to me for years. Long before the ceremony, he'd already broken every one of them. My eyes drifted to the second row. Marcus sat exactly where we'd placed him on the seating chart, looking relaxed in a tailored navy suit. When he caught me looking, he smiled and gave me a small nod. A few months earlier, that gesture would have felt reassuring. Now it only reminded me of how convincing he'd been. Marcus had celebrated our engagement, shared countless dinners with us, and stood in our home acting like family while secretly accepting confidential files from the man standing beside me. Neither of them looked the least bit nervous. The ceremony continued. When the officiant invited Ethan to read his vows, he unfolded a neatly written page and looked at me with the same warm smile that had once made me feel safe. I've spent the last 4 years trying to become the man you deserve, he began. Something tightened in my chest. Not because I believed him, because I remembered the time when I would have. You've been my safest place, my biggest supporter, and my best friend, he continued. I promise to choose you every single day for the rest of my life. Several guests wiped away tears. My mother smiled proudly. Ethan's parents reached for each other's hands, and even Marcus lowered his head as if the vows had genuinely moved him. When Ethan finished, the room filled with applause. The officiant turned to me with an encouraging smile. Natalie, your vows. I unfolded the sheet of paper I'd been holding. It was blank. I let the silence linger for a moment before looking around the room. Every familiar face was smiling back at me, believing they were about to witness the happiest moment of our lives. I took a slow breath. Before I read my vows, I'd like to show everyone something. The officiant blinked in surprise. Oh? It'll only take a few minutes. Ethan let out a quiet laugh. What is this? A surprise slideshow? You could call it that. A ripple of laughter moved through the guests. Someone whispered, I love it when couples do this. Exactly. That was what everyone expected. I turned toward Kevin, the technician standing beside the projector. We'd spoken briefly before the ceremony, and I told him there would be a short presentation before my vows. Nothing about the request had seemed unusual. The USBs ready? I asked. He nodded. Already plugged in. Open the second folder. He frowned for a second. The second one? Yes. Without another question, he clicked the remote. The ballroom lights dimmed, conversations faded, and every guest turned toward the large screen behind us. Soft instrumental music began playing as the title appeared. Our Journey. Smiles spread across the room. The first image showed our engagement. Applause broke out. Then came a beach vacation, followed by Christmas with both families. Guests relaxed, exactly as I'd expected them to. The screen faded to black. Kevin glanced at me, waiting for confirmation. I gave him a slight nod. He opened the second folder. For a heartbeat, the screen stayed blank. Then the first image appeared. It wasn't another vacation photo. It was surveillance footage from the entrance of a luxury hotel. Ethan and Olivia Hayes walked through the doors hand in hand. The ballroom fell completely silent. Ethan's smile disappeared. Marcus sat up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. My mother looked from the screen to me, completely bewildered. "What?" someone whispered. The next image appeared. Ethan and Olivia laughing over a candlelit dinner. Then another. The images moved from dinner to the hotel elevator before ending with the two of them entering the same room together. Both of them entering the same room with a single keycard. A quiet gasp rippled through the audience. Ethan slowly turned toward me, all the color draining from his face. "Natalie." His voice barely carried across the silence. "What is this?" I looked at him without saying a word. For the first time in weeks, I no longer had to hide what I knew. For several long seconds, no one moved. The guests looked from the screen to Ethan, then back to me, struggling to make sense of what they had just seen. Ethan let out a strained laugh and reached for my arm. "Babe, there has to be some mistake." I stepped back before he could touch me. "There isn't." The next slide appeared. It wasn't another photograph. It was the hotel's check-in record, showing the date, time, room number, and both of their names. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. "Oh my God." Olivia Hayes. The ex-girlfriend Ethan had sworn he'd never speak to again. The woman he'd insisted was nothing more than a distant memory. My father slowly rose to his feet, staring at the screen in disbelief. "What exactly am I looking at?" No one answered. The presentation did. Hotel security footage replaced the receipt. Ethan had his arm around Olivia as they crossed the lobby together. A few seconds later, he kissed her forehead before they disappeared toward the elevators. The timestamp matched the same weekend he'd claimed he was spending in a cabin with Marcus. Behind me, I heard his voice. "Natalie, please." It was the first time all day he'd sounded afraid. "You don't understand." I looked at him. "No, Ethan, I understand exactly what happened." The slideshow moved on. The hotel photos gave way to something even harder to dismiss. Daniel Foster's investigation report filled the screen, followed by authenticated records showing unauthorized access to my company's servers, the IP addresses involved, device information, and the forensic analysis confirming every step. The ballroom fell silent again. Guests leaned forward, reading each page as it appeared. Next came the internal server logs, documenting every confidential file Ethan had downloaded, every unauthorized login from our home network, and every transfer linked to his account. His father slowly removed his glasses. "No!" His voice barely carried across the room. "This can't be right." Then the emails appeared. Confidential company documents had been sent to a consulting account created under a fake business name. A few guests exchanged confused looks until the following slide connected everything. The consulting account automatically forwarded every stolen file to Marcus Reed's company. Heads turned toward the second row. Marcus had gone completely pale. He shifted uneasily in his seat, glancing toward the exits before realizing there was nowhere to go without drawing even more attention to himself. The projector continued. Bank records appeared next, showing payments flowing from Marcus's company into Ethan's consulting account. Every deposit matched another batch of stolen files. The final summary displayed the entire timeline on a single page. Documents taken from my company, transferred to Marcus, and followed by payment. The presentation didn't need narration. The documents were enough. A woman near the back whispered, "He sold her company." The word spread through the room almost immediately. He sold her company. He was getting paid. My God. Ethan suddenly stepped in front of the screen. "Turn it off." He pointed toward Kevin, the technician. "Turn it off right now." Kevin hesitated and looked at me instead. I met his eyes and gave a small nod. "Keep it playing." Without another word, he pressed the remote, and the next slide appeared behind Ethan's silhouette, forcing him to choose between stepping aside or standing in front of evidence everyone had already seen. Ethan couldn't block the evidence. At best, he could stand in front of it. Marcus shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous." He let out a strained laugh and pointed at the screen. "Emails can be faked." Before I could respond, Daniel Foster calmly stepped out from the third row. I'd invited him to the wedding for one reason only, not as a guest, but as a witness. He handed a folder to my attorney, Rebecca Collins. Rebecca faced the room with the same composure she'd shown in every meeting we'd had. "The investigation was conducted by an independent cyber forensics firm," she said. "Every document you've seen today has been authenticated, preserved, and verified according to legal standards." She paused before adding, "Copies of the complete evidence package have already been delivered to the appropriate authorities." A wave of murmurs swept through the ballroom. Marcus opened his mouth as if he wanted to argue, but no words came out. Ethan looked from Rebecca to Daniel, then back at me. The realization slowly settled over him. This wasn't an emotional decision I'd made in the middle of the ceremony. I'd been preparing for this for weeks. "You set me up," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No, I gave you every opportunity to tell me the truth. You chose not to." His breathing became uneven. "It was one mistake." I held his gaze. "One mistake?" I pointed toward the screen behind him. "Cheating wasn't a mistake. Stealing wasn't a mistake. Taking money from my company's confidential files wasn't a mistake either. Those were decisions you kept making over and over again." He looked away. There was nothing left for him to say. His mother covered her face with both hands. His father slowly walked toward him, his voice barely holding together. "Ethan, tell me she isn't telling the truth." Ethan never answered. He just stared at the floor. That silence was all his parents needed. Marcus suddenly turned toward the aisle. Rebecca stepped into his path before he could leave. "I wouldn't do that." He frowned. "Why?" "Because investigators already have everything. You'll have plenty of chances to explain yourself." Marcus stood frozen for a moment before quietly returning to his seat. Around us, the room dissolved into whispers. Some guests were crying. Others simply stared, trying to process what they had witnessed. More and more phones appeared as people began recording, but I no longer cared. Whether people recorded it or not didn't matter anymore. Ethan took a hesitant step toward me. "Natalie, please." His eyes were wet. "We can fix this. I love you." For years, those words had been enough. Now they sounded hollow. Without saying anything, I slipped my engagement ring off my finger. The diamond caught the light as I held it for a moment. "I spent weeks wondering what hurt the most," I said quietly. "Finding out you cheated, or finding out you were selling the company I spent years building." I glanced toward Marcus. In the end, neither was the hardest part. I looked back at Ethan. "The hardest part was realizing the two of you expected me to accept all of it." I placed the ring in his shaking hand. It felt strangely insignificant. The officiant silently offered me the microphone. The ballroom fell quiet again. I looked around the room before speaking. "A few weeks ago, Ethan told me something I'll never forget." I paused. "He said sleeping with someone else wasn't wrong because we weren't married yet." Several guests lowered their eyes. Others looked at Ethan with open disappointment. I took one last breath. He was right about one thing. I looked directly at him. "We're still not married. And we never will be." No one applauded. The silence that followed carried more weight than any argument ever could. I handed the microphone back to the officiant and turned to Rebecca. She gave me a sealed envelope containing the civil filings we'd prepared. I passed another copy to Daniel for the investigators. "It's already underway," he said with a nod. I looked around the ballroom one final time. I took one last look around the ballroom. My parents stood together near the front. Ethan's family looked devastated, and Marcus hadn't moved from his chair. Behind them, the last slide remained frozen on the screen. Finally, I met Ethan's eyes. "You didn't lose me today," I said. "You lost me the day you decided I'd never find out." I turned and walked down the aisle without looking back. Nearly 200 guests stood in complete silence as I passed them. No one tried to stop me. The moment the ballroom doors closed behind me, my phone began vibrating. One notification, then another. Within minutes, what had happened inside that room was already spreading far beyond it. The ballroom doors closed behind me, shutting out the whispers, the arguments, and everything that had just happened inside. A warm breeze brushed across my face as I stepped outside the venue. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't pretending to be someone who still believed in her relationship. Behind those doors, guests were trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Some were comforting each other, others were arguing, and many were probably still staring at the projection screen, wondering how a wedding had turned into the beginning of a criminal investigation. I heard the doors swing open again. "Natalie!" My mother hurried toward me, clutching a crumpled tissue in one hand. Her mascara had started to run, but she didn't seem to notice. She wrapped me in a tight embrace without saying a word. We stood there quietly for several moments before she finally pulled back. "You knew," she said softly. I nodded. "For weeks." She searched my face. "Why didn't you tell us?" I couldn't risk anyone finding out before I had proof. Her eyes filled with tears. "You carried all of this by yourself?" I had to. She hugged me again, even tighter this time. "I'm so sorry." Those simple words hit harder than I expected. Not because I wanted sympathy, but because they were the first completely honest words I'd heard since the ceremony began. A few minutes later, my father joined us. He looked exhausted. "I just spoke with Ethan's father." "What did he say?" "He kept apologizing." Dad rubbed a hand across his face. "I honestly don't think he knew any of this." I don't think he did either. Neither of Ethan's parents had betrayed me. Like me, they'd trusted someone they loved and never imagined what he was capable of. Rebecca and Daniel stepped outside shortly afterward. "It's done," Rebecca said. "The evidence has been turned over?" She nodded. "The authorities have everything they need, and venue security has already secured a copy of the presentation." Daniel added, "There were plenty of witnesses, too. Dozens of guests recorded parts of it." "I figured." Rebecca glanced at the phone in my hand. "You might want to put that on silent." I looked down at the screen. The notifications were arriving faster than I could read them. Missed calls, text messages, voicemails, emails, and requests from numbers I didn't recognize. Ethan had already called 7 times. Marcus was blocked before I even opened his messages. I muted the phone and slipped it into my purse. "It can all wait until tomorrow." Rebecca gave a small nod. "I have a feeling tomorrow's going to be busy." She wasn't wrong. That evening, I checked into a hotel still wearing my wedding dress, bouquet and all. The receptionist recognized me almost immediately. Her expression shifted from surprise to sympathy. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "It's okay." Without another word, she upgraded my room and refused to charge me the difference. After thanking her, I took the elevator upstairs, slipped off my heels, and sat beside the window overlooking the city. For the first time that day, there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to prove, and no one expecting me to smile. I simply sat there, watching the city lights come on one by one, letting the silence settle around me. For the rest of the evening, there were no more lies to uncover, no more fake smiles to force, and no more wedding plans to discuss. The silence in the room felt unfamiliar, but after everything that had happened, it was exactly what I needed. Around midnight, I turned my phone back on. Hundreds of messages flooded the screen. Most were from friends asking if I was okay. Others were from people who had watched the wedding fall apart in real time and couldn't believe what they'd seen. Ethan's messages were mixed in with the rest. "Natalie, please answer." A few minutes later, another appeared. "We need to talk." Then another. None of this had to happen. A few more followed. Olivia meant nothing.
Marcus manipulated me.
I still love you. I read every message once, then deleted them without replying. Nothing he could say would change what he'd already done. The next morning, my phone was filled with news alerts. Someone had uploaded almost the entire ceremony online, and the video spread faster than I ever expected. By breakfast, it had already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Before lunchtime, the number had climbed into the millions. The reactions were exactly what you'd expect. Some people supported me. Others thought I should have handled everything privately, and plenty argued over whether Ethan deserved another chance. I ignored all of it. None of those opinions mattered. Around noon, Liam called. "You've probably seen the video." I have. So have our clients. I braced myself. They're standing behind us. I frowned. They are? We've already heard from several of our biggest clients. Every one of them thanked us for responding immediately instead of trying to cover up the breach. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For weeks, I'd convinced myself the scandal would destroy the company. Instead, being transparent had strengthened the trust we'd spent years building. Later that afternoon, Marcus's company released a statement confirming that he had been suspended while the investigation was underway. His system access was revoked immediately, and by that evening, the board announced his termination, citing serious ethical violations and the unlawful acquisition of confidential business information. Less than an hour later, Ethan's employer issued a statement of its own. He was placed on indefinite administrative leave, while investigators reviewed his involvement in the theft. Everything was unraveling much faster than either of them expected. Rebecca called shortly afterward. "Investigators executed the first search warrant this morning." "So quickly?" "The forensic evidence gave them enough to move immediately." She explained that both Ethan's and Marcus's electronic devices had been seized. "What about Olivia?" "They've interviewed her. Beyond that, we don't know yet." After ending the call, I sat quietly for a while. The anger I'd been carrying for weeks was beginning to fade, not because I felt sorry for Ethan or Marcus, but because the outcome no longer depended on me. The evidence was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. 2 days later, I met Rebecca again. The criminal complaint had officially been filed, including charges related to trade secret theft, corporate espionage, conspiracy, and electronic fraud. Every allegation was supported by the forensic investigation Daniel had completed weeks earlier. "There will probably be settlement discussions," Rebecca said. "I don't want this handled quietly." "I didn't think you would." "I want everything documented." She nodded. "It will be." As I stood to leave, she stopped me. "There's one more thing." She handed me a printed email. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to her because Ethan already knew I wouldn't answer his calls. The message was short. "I know Natalie won't speak to me. Please tell her I'm sorry. I never wanted this to go so far. I'd give anything for one chance to explain." I read it once before handing it back. He already had that chance. Rebecca slipped the paper into the case file without another word. About a week after the wedding, Ethan's parents asked if we could meet. We chose a quiet cafe halfway across town. His mother looked exhausted, as though she'd barely slept since the ceremony. "Natalie," she said softly, "I'm so ashamed. You don't have anything to apologize for. We raised him, but you didn't make his decisions." Her eyes filled with tears. "We loved you like family." "I know." His father had barely touched his coffee. Finally, he looked up. "I keep wishing we'd known before the wedding." "So do I." He lowered his eyes again. "I ask myself every day where we went wrong." I didn't have an answer. Some questions never have one. When we said goodbye, his mother hugged me tightly. "I hope one day you find someone who deserves the loyalty you gave our son." "I hope so too." A few days later, the airline emailed about our honeymoon reservation. The flights to Italy were still confirmed. Instead of canceling them, I called customer service. "I need to change the reservation." "So only one passenger will be traveling?" "That's right. Would you like us to cancel the second ticket?" I looked out the office window before answering. "No. Just leave the seat empty." There was a brief pause. "Of course." After hanging up, I sat there for a long time. I'd spent years imagining that flight as the beginning of my marriage. Instead, it became the first step toward a life I would finally build for myself. I left for Italy 11 days after the wedding that never happened. The flights, hotels, and itinerary were exactly the ones Ethan and I had planned together. The only difference was that every reservation had originally been made for 2 people. At almost every hotel, the receptionist glanced at the booking before looking back at me. "Just one guest?" "Just one." The first few days felt unfamiliar. For years, I'd pictured this trip as the beginning of my marriage, but instead it became the first time in a long while that I was completely alone with my own thoughts. I spent quiet mornings wandering through narrow streets before the crowds arrived. Afternoons disappeared inside museums, bookstores, and little cafes where no one knew my name. Without realizing it, I stopped checking my phone every few minutes or wondering what excuse Ethan might give next. Somewhere between Rome and Florence, I noticed that my mind had finally gone quiet. Halfway through the trip, Rebecca called. "I thought you'd rather hear this from me than the news." "I'm listening." Marcus accepted a plea agreement. I sat down on a stone bench overlooking the Arno River. "What happens now?" "He'll serve 18 months in prison, pay substantial financial penalties, and he's permanently barred from holding an executive position in the industry." I looked out across the river for a long moment. Marcus had spent years building his reputation. He destroyed it in a matter of months. What about Ethan? "There wasn't enough evidence to prove he planned the entire scheme," Rebecca said. "But there was more than enough to prove he knowingly took part in it." She explained that Ethan had pleaded guilty to reduced charges involving the unauthorized disclosure of trade secrets and financial fraud connected to the consulting payments. "So he isn't going to prison?" "No, he received probation, community service, restitution, and civil penalties." "And financially?" "He'll be paying for those decisions for a long time." After we hung up, I sat there watching people cross the bridge, expecting to feel some sense of victory. Instead, I just felt lighter. The investigation no longer depended on me. 2 weeks later, I returned home. When I walked into the office, my team greeted me with applause. Liam grinned. "We almost filled the conference room with balloons." I laughed. "I think this is enough." He handed me the latest quarterly report. "I've been waiting for you to see this." I opened it expecting weeks of damage control. Instead, revenue had increased. Several existing clients had expanded their contracts, and new companies had reached out after seeing how quickly we responded to the security breach. One client included a note that stayed with me. "If this is how your company handles a crisis from within, we know our business is in good hands." I read the sentence twice. For months, I'd been convinced Ethan's betrayal would undo everything I'd built. Instead, our willingness to confront it openly had strengthened the trust we'd spent years earning. Over the following months, the criminal cases finally came to an end. Marcus admitted in court that he had knowingly obtained confidential corporate information through Ethan. The hearing was brief and surprisingly quiet. There were no emotional speeches or dramatic confrontations, just evidence, guilty pleas, and a judge formally handing down his sentence. His career ended that day. Ethan appeared in court several weeks later. He looked thinner than I remembered. His shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. He seemed older too, not because much time had passed, but because months of investigations, lawsuits, and public scrutiny had caught up with him all at once. When the judge asked whether he accepted responsibility, Ethan lowered his head and answered quietly, "Yes." It was the most honest thing I'd heard him say in a very long time. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around both legal teams, shouting questions, as cameras followed every step. I walked past them without slowing down until one voice called after me. "Natalie, do you have anything you'd like to say to Ethan?" I stopped for a moment and looked back. I already said everything that needed to be said. Then I kept walking. The civil cases wrapped up not long afterward. My company recovered everything we were legally entitled to recover, and although not every loss could be measured in dollars, we regained something even more valuable, the confidence of our clients. Nearly a year passed. Life settled into a routine that had nothing to do with court dates or investigations. I went back to work, spent weekends hiking, had dinner with my parents, and slowly stopped measuring time by everything that had happened. One afternoon, while waiting for my coffee, a woman approached me. "Excuse me, were you the bride from that wedding?" I was. She smiled nervously. "I've wanted to thank you." I must have looked confused because she quickly explained. "My sister stayed with a man who lied to her for years. She thought leaving would make her the bad person. After watching your story, she finally walked away." For a moment, I couldn't find the right words. Instead, I gave her a hug. We never know how our choices might help someone else. Several months later, while clearing old files from my laptop, I found a folder named Wedding Presentation. I stared at it for a while before opening it. The photographs were still there. The investigation reports. The emails. The financial records. Every piece of evidence that had ended one chapter of my life. I copied everything onto an external drive, archived it, and permanently deleted the folder from my computer. I wasn't deleting the files because I regretted what I'd done. I deleted them because I no longer needed them. That evening, I stood on my apartment balcony, watching the sun disappear behind the Seattle skyline. It was the same view I'd stared at the night before my wedding, wondering whether Ethan had ever truly loved me. By then, I realized the answer no longer mattered. Whether he had loved me once or had been lying all along didn't change what he chose to do. Those decisions belonged to him, not me. The hardest part wasn't learning to forgive him. It was learning to stop carrying his choices into my own future. That happened so gradually, I almost missed it. One day I realized I hadn't wondered where Ethan was, who he was with, or whether he regretted everything he'd lost. I simply didn't care anymore. Looking back, I don't remember the flowers. I don't remember the music. I remember the moment I realized I couldn't marry someone who looked me in the eyes and lied without blinking. The wedding never happened. Walking away was still the best decision I ever made.